I used to think toxic parents were easy to spot. Loud voices, harsh punishments, obvious neglect, the kind of things you can point at and say, that's wrong. But life has a funny way of teaching you that the most damaging patterns don't always come dressed as cruelty. Sometimes they arrive dressed as concern, even love. Over the years, I've watched children grow into adults carrying invisible weight they can't quite explain. They'll say things like, I had a good home, so why do I feel so lost? And that question alone tells me everything, because what hurts most isn't always what was done to them, it's what was quietly normalized. There are patterns in parenting that don't look toxic on the surface. In fact, they often look responsible, protective, even admirable. But beneath that surface, something else is happening, something that slowly reshapes how a child sees themselves, how they trust their emotions, and how they step into the world. Today, I want to break down three of those hidden characteristics. Not the obvious extremes, but the subtle ones, the kind that slip under the radar for years before they show their full impact. If you've ever questioned your upbringing or wondered why certain emotional patterns feel hard to shake, this might start connecting a few dots. And the first one is far more common than most people like to admit. There is a type of parenting that rarely gets questioned because, on the surface, it looks responsible, it looks caring, it looks like sacrifice. But underneath it, there is something quieter happening, control that wears the mask of love. I've seen it in families where every decision a child makes is gently corrected before it ever has a chance to exist. What to study, who to be friends with, how to dress, even how to think about the future. The parent doesn't present it as control, of course. They present it as wisdom, experience, protection. I've lived longer than you. I know how the world works. You'll thank me later. And maybe in some cases, they genuinely believe that. That's what makes it so complicated, because the intention feels clean, but the effect slowly becomes suffocating. What happens in these homes is not loud conflict, it's subtle replacement of decision making. A child might say, I want to try this, and instead of exploration, they get redirection. Not always harshly, sometimes gently, even affectionately, but consistently enough that over time, the child stops trusting their own judgment. Psychologically, this falls under what experts call psychological control, where a parent doesn't just guide behavior, but shapes inner thought. It's different from structure or discipline. Healthy guidance says, let me help you think this through. Control, disguised as love, says, you don't need to think. I've already done it for you. And here's where it gets interesting. The child often doesn't resist at first. In fact, many adapt by becoming easy children. They comply, they avoid conflict, they learn that peace at home comes from surrendering choice. So everything looks fine on the outside, but developmentally, something important is being delayed: autonomy. I remember observing a young teenager who couldn't decide what he liked without first scanning his mother's reaction in his mind. Even simple choices, colors, hobbies, opinions, felt unsafe unless approved internally by her voice. That is what long-term control does. It doesn't just influence decisions, it becomes the internal decision maker. And the emotional cost shows up later in life. These children often grow into adults who hesitate, not because they lack intelligence, but because they were never trained to trust it. They second-guess themselves constantly. They over-rely on external validation. Even simple decisions feel heavy, as if there is a correct answer they might miss. What's most ironic is that these parents often believe they are preventing failure. But what they unintentionally prevent is something more important than success: confidence in one's ability to handle life. And there's another layer people miss. When a child grows up under constant "I know better," love becomes tangled with obedience. So later in life, saying no feels like betrayal, not boundary setting. Independence feels like guilt. That's the quiet cost of control disguised as care. And this is just the first layer, because even when control is present, there is something even more disorienting that can shape a child's emotional world when their feelings themselves are not allowed to fully exist. There's a form of parenting that doesn't raise its voice, doesn't necessarily punish, and still manages to quietly reshape a child's entire emotional world. It happens in moments that seem small at the time: dismissed feelings, brushed off experiences, corrected emotions. A child comes home upset and says, "That hurt me." And instead of curiosity or concern, they hear things like, "You're overreacting," or "It wasn't that serious." Sometimes it's even more subtle: a sigh, a change of subject, or a look that says, "This feeling is inconvenient." At first, the child tries to adjust. They explain better. They soften their emotions. They try to get it right. But over time, something deeper starts to happen. They stop trusting their own internal experience. This is what emotional psychologists refer to as emotional invalidation. It's not just ignoring feelings, it's consistently reshaping them until the child starts questioning whether their emotional responses are legitimate at all. And in some homes, it goes a step further into what feels like reality distortion, not in an obvious, dramatic way, but in small rewrites of memory and meaning. A child remembers an event as painful, but the parent reframes it. "That didn't happen like that," or "You were actually fine afterward." Not always intentional manipulation, but repeated enough that the child begins to doubt their own perception. This is where things become psychologically complicated because a child's emotional brain is still under construction. They don't yet have the internal tools to separate "my feelings are valid" from "my feelings are approved." So they learn approval first. And what gets built in that environment is not emotional strength, but emotional doubt. I've seen adults who can describe events from their childhood in detail, but still hesitate to trust how they felt about them. They'll pause mid sentence and say things like, "Maybe I'm remembering it wrong," even when their memory is consistent. That hesitation didn't come from nowhere, it was trained. When a child's emotional reality is repeatedly dismissed, they begin to outsource their emotional truth. They start scanning others to confirm what they feel. If someone else says it's not serious, they downgrade their pain. If someone validates it, they suddenly feel permission to experience it. That creates a fragile emotional system, one that depends heavily on external feedback instead of internal clarity. And there's another subtle consequence: over explanation. These individuals often grow into adults who feel the need to justify every emotional reaction, not just to others, but to themselves, as if feelings must pass an invisible court before they are allowed to exist. What makes this especially confusing is that the parent may genuinely believe they are helping the child become stronger. In some households, toughness is mistaken for emotional suppression, but resilience is not the absence of emotion. It's the ability to feel something fully and still function. When emotions are consistently minimized, the child doesn't become stronger, they become uncertain. And uncertainty about your own emotional truth is one of the most exhausting internal states a person can carry into adulthood. But even this, control and emotional invalidation, isn't the full picture, because there is another dynamic that can quietly dissolve a child's sense of self altogether, not by pushing them away, but by pulling them too close. There is a kind of parenting that doesn't feel like distance at all. In fact, it feels like closeness: constant involvement, constant we, constant togetherness. But sometimes, what looks like deep connection is actually something more complicated when a child is not allowed to fully become their own person. This is what family psychologists refer to as enmeshment, and it's one of the most overlooked patterns because it hides behind loyalty, sacrifice, and emotional closeness. In these dynamics, boundaries are blurry. A child's choices don't feel entirely like their own, not because they are directly forced, but because the emotional weight of family expectations is always present in the background. The child learns early that independence is not just personal, it affects the emotional stability of the entire family system. So instead of asking, "What do I want?" they start asking, "What will keep everyone okay?" And that shift is subtle but powerful. In some households, the child becomes emotionally responsible for the parent, not in obvious ways like caregiving, but in emotional tone setting. If the parent is unhappy, the child feels pressure to fix it. If there is tension, the child adjusts behavior to smooth it out. Over time, the child becomes highly skilled at reading emotional environments, but less skilled at defining their own. What often gets lost here is individuation, the developmental process where a young person separates their identity from their caregivers and forms a stable sense of self. When enmeshment is strong, that process doesn't fully complete. I've seen adults who struggle to answer simple identity questions without referencing family expectations. Career choices, relationships, even personal preferences are filtered through an internal question. Will this disrupt the system I came from? And the emotional cost is quiet but heavy. These individuals often become people pleasers, not because they lack backbone, but because disagreement once felt like emotional disruption. Saying no didn't just mean preference, it felt like disconnection. There's also a deeper identity confusion that can emerge. On the surface, they may appear responsible, mature, even selfless. But internally, there is often a persistent sense of, who am I when I'm not being what others need me to be? That question doesn't come from rebellion, it comes from underdevelopment of self definition. And here's the irony: these children are often raised in homes that value closeness, unity, and loyalty. But when those values are not balanced with individuality, they can unintentionally become constraints instead of support. Healthy attachment allows distance without fear. Enmeshment treats distance as danger. So the child learns to stay close, even when closeness costs clarity of self. And over time, the hardest part isn't conflict or discipline. It's realizing that you can be deeply connected to people you love and still not fully know who you are outside of them. That is the quiet endpoint of enmeshment. Not rebellion, not escape, but identity blur. And when you put all three patterns together, control disguised as love, emotional invalidation, and enmeshment, you begin to see how easily a child's inner world can be shaped without a single loud moment. Which leads us to the final reflection. How do we recognize these patterns in ourselves or in the way we were raised before they quietly repeat into the next generation? When you put all three patterns side by side, a clearer picture starts to form. Control disguised as love teaches a child not to trust their own decisions. Emotional invalidation teaches them not to trust their own feelings. And enmeshment teaches them not to trust their own identity outside of others. Individually, each one can be subtle enough to go unnoticed in a household that still looks normal from the outside. But together, they quietly shape how a person moves through life, how they choose, how they feel, and even how they define who they are. And the most important thing to understand here is this: these patterns don't always come from bad intentions. In many cases, they come from fear, tradition, or misunderstanding what healthy parenting actually looks like. But intent doesn't erase impact. The good news is that awareness changes everything. Once you can name these patterns, you stop normalizing them. You start noticing where your own reactions, hesitations, or emotional habits might have been learned, not chosen. And that awareness is often the first real step toward breaking cycles that have quietly repeated for years. If any part of this felt familiar, I want you to sit with that, not with blame, but with honesty. Because understanding your past doesn't trap you there. It gives you language for things you were never given words for. Now I'm curious, have you ever experienced any of these patterns growing up or noticed them in someone you know? Share your thoughts in the comments. I do go through them, and I may respond where I can. And if you found this insightful, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. There's more coming on the hidden psychology behind parenting, behavior, and emotional development, and I think you'll want to be part of that conversation.